So firstly, a very warm welcome to this webinar, Mapping and Evidence for Healthy Transport. I'm Lawrence Oaksash, CEO of City Science. It's great to see so many of you here to discuss mapping and evidence, so welcome. Whilst I guess COVID-19 has shed a clear spotlight on the importance of active travel, we know as practitioners we can't rest on our laurels, and we need to keep mapping, developing the evidence and building the data to support the design of integrated networks, to understand who's using those networks, and predict demand, and even use data and crowdsourcing to engage key stakeholders. So all of these themes we're going to cover in this webinar, and so hopefully you'll find it valuable. So to add their insights, we're joined by some key expert speakers to give their views today on what data and evidence is most helpful in planning healthy transport. We're joined by Esther Kurland from Urban Design London, Robert Davies from Trueform Engineering, Irene McLeese from C-Sense, and Simon Lusby from City Science. The format for today's fairly simple. We're going to start with some brief introductions from each of our guests before moving on to a panel session where we'll be posing your questions to the panel. You'll hopefully see functionality to ask questions at the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to post any questions that you want to cover. All we ask is that when you do post a question, please include your name and organisation, and we'll make sure we attribute them to you. And to get you thinking, I'm just going to reiterate some of the themes that we hope to cover today. So mapping and evidence for building and developing an integrated network, data around network quality, demographics and journey purposes, how we ensure we take into account a wide range of abilities from the planning networks, demand, what's going to happen with post-COVID demand and where should we be looking for data to factor that into our models, crowdsourced data, what role can crowdsourced data play, and finally, that difficult task of monitoring and verification. But most importantly, this is your webinar. So if there's anything else, any other themes that you think we should be covering, then please put those into chat as well. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Esther Kurland from Urban Design London to set out her thoughts on mapping and evidence for healthy transport.
Well, hello everybody, I feel a little bit like an interloper because I'm not a science person and I don't really work in mapping and science and data collection, but I do know how important they are to good placemaking and management of streets. And I'm just going to very quickly go through a couple of concepts about what type of information we might want to be collecting and why it's important. So if you can click through to the next slide, actually that next one's my introductory slide. This is from Australia. We heard about how Australia community are sort of just trying to change people's attitudes to what the streets are about, and how subjective and issues and attitudes and this type of intervention, which is just tactical urbanism, it's just let's tuck some stuff down on the floor and repurpose that bit of space. They're evidence too, and it's very hard to collect that type of evidence, but it matters to a lot of people, and it's the sort of things that change attitudes. So just to keep that in mind as a thing, how do we collect non-scientific or non-numerical data? Very important in the way things are changing in streets at the moment. Now, many of you, I'm sure, have seen the link place graph, which was part of the TfL Roads Task Force approach, where we're saying every bit of street has both a living function and a place function. I've pinched these two graphs off Deborah Saunt's I always get it wrong because I've got dyslexia, but Deborah Saunt's architectural firm, which I just thought they were really smart, saying not only do different streets have different functions in terms of how much travel there is on them as opposed to how much living there is on them, but also there's different types of people doing different types of travel. And that's something else, sort of a bit more nuance to how do we consider that when we're collecting data on how people are moving around. So how fast are they moving? What are they moving for? How do they feel when they're moving? How do they behave? All of those make a difference. you know, the cyclists from the very fast cyclists going on the dual carriageway, if they're very, very brave, right down to the parent with a kid in the back of the bike, maybe just cycling around the local neighbourhood, residential streets. Next slide, please. So that's a concept to keep in mind, I would say. I'm a planner by background, so I'm really interested in the relationship between transport, movement structure of places, and land uses. And actually those three together make up our cities to a large extent, or create the environment that we use in urban areas. At the moment, we are pretty bad at linking, particularly understanding the destinations and where the doors are, and how those affect things like desire lines to major destination buildings, whether they're a school or a hospital or whatever it happens to be, and the clustering of destinations. So people using more than one building within a trip. And we're really bad at understanding and planning that alongside an understanding of what is the most connected parts of our area, and then what the quality of that urban space is like, that urban realm is like, to move around within. So, you know, with data, to be able to bring these things together gives us a much richer understanding of the potential for our different parts of our city. Next slide, please. And there's 3 slides that go together next, I think. So this is 800 meters as the crow flies from that station working drawing, which I know gets used quite a lot in the industry. I don't think it's particularly useful personally, and I think when we're talking about accessibility and catchment areas, etc., we really should be thinking about as the footfalls. So if you go on to the next slide, this is the same area as a proper footfall, 800 meters from the station, and it's not a circle. So things like railway lines will create barriers which mean that people aren't able to do what you theoretically think that they will be able to do. And actually, if you move on to the next slide, the situation's even worse than just mapping the distance down the streets. That shape was created by just mapping those routes. How far do people walk on the public realm? But then if you look at some of the issues that we've got with poor quality junctions, or flooded underpasses, or bridges that don't work, or not everyone can use the bridge, that whole space, that whole catchment area actually gets much smaller again. So to understand that, the real catchment area, which influences behaviour, I think is really very, very important, rather than the theoretical catchment areas on accessibility. Because then we can actually look at how do we improve the issues where those crosses are and make that catchment bigger. It helps us to understand how people are going to use that area. So I don't know if that was 3 minutes or more, but it was quick as I could be, and just a few observations of the type of thing that it would be very useful for the urban design community, placemaking community, to have more information on. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Esther. I love the accessibility, and there will be lots of discussion about accessibility through this webinar. So next, I'm going to hand over to Robert Davies from Trueform Engineering.
Thanks, Lawrence. Afternoon all, I'm Robert Davis, the Wayfinding and Placemaking Manager at Trueform, which is a technology and manufacturing company providing for all modes of passenger transport. I've got over 15 years experience personally in the industry, designing, manufacturing, installing and maintaining market-leading street infrastructure. Let's try this video, Lawrence, to show a short introduction to Trueform and the areas that we operate, including a selection of world-recognised wayfinding systems. Do you think we can play that video, Lawrence? Thank you. for that. Wayfinding is, let's move on to, let's move through these slides, Lawrence. If you move on to the next one, it's just about us. So why wayfinding? So wayfinding is the movement of people from A to B, which is aided by the physical infrastructure, which provides key route information. The benefits of wayfinding, if you move on to another slide, Lawrence, please. So there are fundamental benefits to a good wayfinding system, which include the promotion of walking as the primary transport mode. You can really highlight those quiet routes or emphasize the green spaces. It improves connectivity between public spaces and public transport. It reduces congestion by encouraging sustainable active travel. It can inspire exploration and increases footfall, helping those businesses increase trade, which at this time is obviously essential. It creates a safe and welcoming environment. And then you can use it to publicize improvements to the public realm and the transport infrastructure. If you move on, Lawrence. So that's just a selection of some of the wayfinding totems that we've installed across numerous cities. If you move on again, please. So wayfinding isn't just signage, it can be in other forms for navigation, such as offering further information as within a parklet shown here in Birmingham. Or if you move on again, Lawrence, please. Or with our street widening measure, when we work with Better Bankside and Steer in Southwark. This project trials a temporary reconfiguration of Lavington Street to a one-way street and uses up the free road space to extend the footpath through the design of new modular structure. The innovative structure will help to test how streets and pavements can be reconfigured to respond to the changing pressures that streets and cities and towns face. If we move on again. I think that's, yeah, if we just finally closing, we understand the costs involved in implementing a wayfinding system. However, we ensure value for investment with a proven system adopted by many leading towns and cities. As we all know now, the advantages of a wayfinding system are widely known and understood. They have significant health and environmental benefits, which now more than ever can be the kickstart to encouraging more walking and cycling. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Now going to pass on to Irene from C-Sense. So over to you, Irene.
Okay, thank you. So hi everyone, I'm Irene McAleese. I'm co-founder of C-Sense. Next, please. C-Sense is a cycling technology and data company based in Northern Ireland. So we create cycling technology products that make cycling safer, but also engage our community to share powerful data insights that can help improve conditions for cycling. Next, please. So we're known for our intelligent and connected bike lights. We're also launching a new tracker soon, and we're moving into bike share integration. But what makes C-Sense different is that our products contain advanced sensor technology. We use edge processing and AI on the device to capture never before seen insights. We do have an app that pairs with our products as well to provide some very compelling services for the cyclist. Next, please. And using the app, people can also make reports about their ride. So it's quite complementary to the sensor data that we collect. So people can make these reports about close passes, infrastructure requests. And we're happy to say that those C-Sense reports are actually made available free to local councils or authorities. So if anyone on the call is interested in those, do reach out. But it's a combination of our sensor data with those reports creates a really powerful data set that can be used to help for planning. If you could go to the next slide, thanks. When we're working with partners, we can deploy a project using about 200 cyclists as a minimum. And this gives us quite good coverage across an area and also enables you to target specific groups, such as commuter cyclists or women cyclists, for example, to make sure you have the representation in your data pool that you'd like. Next slide, please. Just to give you a quick feel for the data, and I'm going to ask Lawrence, you'll be moving at speed through these data slides, but this is just to show you how quickly the data can build. This is 200 cyclists collecting data over a 6 to 12 week period in London. Next. This is showing speed. So in zone 1 there, you can see there's dedicated cycle infrastructure. Cyclists are benefiting by being able to travel a little faster along that area. Next slide, please. You can also look at things like dwell time. So how long people are waiting at different locations. Next, please. This is looking at the very granular data that we collect around swerving and braking. So the bridge on the left-hand side has dedicated cycle infrastructure with a segregation, and on the right it doesn't. There's much more swerving on the lanes that don't have that segregation, providing you some nice evidence about how your infrastructure is performing. And quite unique to C-SENS, we collect data on road surface quality, which is obviously really important for not only the safety of cyclists, but also the comfort. Next, please. This road surface data was used by AECOM in a level of service analysis in Dublin, along with the delays and average speed information. Next, please. And something that we can do as well is to disaggregate the data down to profile level where we have significant usage. So looking at how do women experience the road, for example, compared to men in terms of road roughness or other variables. As well, we can look at age and also e-bike use. That's a quick whip through. So hopefully that helps to give you a feel for the kind of data that we're collecting at C-SENS, and happy to take any questions as we go through. Thank you.
I love it. I love all of the data that you're collecting, Owen. I think it's fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Simon from City Science to talk about some of the mapping that we do. Simon.
Okay, so firstly, thanks everyone for joining. And I quite like the panel we've got that it actually spreads everything from how we're actually designing the road and who we're designing it for, through to how we're collecting that data, and then how you can also get around the network. So that feels quite nice. What I want to talk more about is what data can be applied for. Lawrence, can you go on to the next slide? So just to cover quickly, City Science, we're doing everything from climate, energy, active travel, and public transport and new mobility. I won't go into that too much, but you'll get these slides if you want to read a bit more about what we do. Now, from a health point of view, an important thing is how we actually access the services. So what services you can actually get to, either by walking or cycling or just social inclusion. So it's important to be able to understand how far you can get using bike access to education, for example, in the top right there, or work we were doing for the NHS around catchment analysis. And what we find is that driving obviously has the widest catchment, whereas sometimes those cycling will have a broader catchment than public transport in these localized areas. And then we need to be thinking about how we plan for active travel as well. So how do we address the barriers such as what Esther was talking about around like railway lines, things like that. And the best way to do that is to actually have the community come in and help to inform that. So the more tools that we have where people can feed back on whether it's potholes or their solutions to improvements is really important. Also, anything to do with like reducing traffic, reducing speed, and delivering your connected up networks. Then we also want to reduce carbon near people. So that means we actually have to understand where the emissions are near the people, where it's coming from the trucks. Is that near schools, and how we understand that. And we just don't disaggregate that enough at the moment. And we need to be collecting that in a better way, disaggregating that better, and actually showing the impacts on who's impacted by, for example, the emissions. How fast are those vehicles going in different locations, and that'll tell us what the emissions are. And then also, this is something which we've recently added into our tools, which I'll only cover for a little bit, but how we can now close off roads within our tools, and anyone can then test, if they've got access to our tool, what the impact of that closure would be, which can help really with local communities, with people being, so they can then see, if I close off this road, how does that improve for cycling and walking connections? And that's all about returning the streets to the communities, making quieter streets and making it safer in contraflows and things. And then the final thing, which I wanted to just cover very quickly, thanks for using New Zealand as the example here, Lawrence, is that we need to make models that are open to everyone. We need to make data which is open to everyone. We're going to see a lot of people being furloughed, redundancies, other things like that over the next few months, potentially. And those people still have the skills to be able to help the community if the data is out there, and in a similar way that the professions and consultancies do as well. But we need those models to be accessible in some way. So what our Cadence software can do is it can mean that a person can access the model results and do things like closing roads, looking at increased land use and other things like that in a simple way, and also looking through the results. And that sort of strength to a community or to transport planners who are between roles or whatever can really empower those communities to get involved. So I think we really need to be looking at how we can make the transport models across the UK more open. And that was just to finish on, this is just a quick slide on what Cadence does, which is it's effectively a GIS tool that can also bring in model data and really allow the user better understanding of what they're doing, rather than having to be a modeler. That's all.
Great, thanks, Simon. Okay, so now onto the panel discussion. So please get your questions in via the chat. We're going to start off by talking about how you plan for an integrated network. So, to the panel, what's the most important data sets that you think we need for planning an integrated network of cycle paths or pedestrian paths? Maybe I'll come to you first, Irene.
Well, I would say that it's really critical to firstly understand where people want to go. I think Esther mentioned, the desire lines and being able to understand, those connections amongst the network seems to be very important. That's one of the things that we find that people really value about the C-Sense data is that, you've got some up-to-date information, because a lot of planners at the moment are using things like census data, which can be 10 years old, looking at to try to find origin destination, for example, and it might only be looking at commuter journeys and not capturing, other kinds of journeys. So having data to understand how people are currently using the network in terms of the flow and destination, I think is important. And then, on that network itself, then maybe understanding are there areas that people are even avoiding? You can look at this and go, well, it would make sense that the closest way people should be taking a journey is from A to B, but they're not taking that route. And why is that? And there's some, is there actually an issue with that route? What in the data we saw from Dublin, for example, some of the cobblestone streets are just not attractive for cyclists to ride on because of the comfort level, although they may have been, if you were to look at a map, it would have looked like the most logical route. But cyclists know that that's actually not the best way for them to go, so they're taking different routes. So understanding some of those things around comfort, but also safety, can help, prioritize how you make changes to a network to improve the performance as well.
And what about those other modes? Because obviously, census is used a lot. What are the best sources of, data on desire lines for leisure trips or for education trips? Simon, we know it's all in the transport models.
Well, I guess that's the interesting thing, is that transport models are designed for the peak hour commute or peak period commute. And so you miss a lot of those local short trips that would connect with health. All that you can really get from the models from a health point of view is who you could potentially move from cars to active people, so that people can get there 2 times 10 minutes a day. So from a modeling point of view, it's really limited, I think.
Esther, you're muted. I can see you want to come in there.
I was going to come in left field on it a little bit. 2 points. I didn't hear your first question very well, but in terms of what you need to come up with a good, to understand the network, you actually need some objectives, some very clear objectives, because you can end up with so much information, you don't know what you're trying to achieve. And it's always, that's the hardest bit. So informing the objectives is really important. And in terms of your question about things like desire lines, you really basic thing when highway engineers are looking at schemes to have the buildings and the doors. I mentioned doors before. You know, the plans tend to stop at the back of the pavement. And then you have conversations with people saying, well, where are people trying, you know, with the people designing up a scheme, at whatever scale it is. So, well, where are people coming and going from? Where do they go in? Where are the design lines from larger scale structural sort of networking right down to where do they want to cross the road? And without actually having that information as a, just as a standard, just having the buildings and the doors and what the buildings are used for on every highway plan that anyone's working on, I think would make quite a bit of difference to the way schemes sometimes come forward. So it's not about network, but just generally about data, just a little bit of data about the buildings, please.
What do you think are the biggest data gaps when you're kind of coming at a new scheme? What's the data that you wish was there that wasn't there? Is it that? Is there anything else?
Sorry, my dog is just eating my shoe. 1 second. Come here, you. Go downstairs.
Robert, what's your view on data gaps?
Yeah.
Well, I was actually just going to answer the other point that Esther said about showing the front doors. That's what Legible London does. That's why London and Legible London's so well seen all over the world, really. And it really is a truly connected wayfinding system. What it does show, it emphasizes the green spaces, it emphasizes those quieter routes. It really does emphasize those buildings that Esther was just talking about. It demonstrates what they are, and I suppose it just helps with the heads up mapping as well, rather than north face mapping.
On data gaps, one thing is that when you get we aggregate so much data to be able to use it, and we aggregate it at the start, and by the end of the process, when we actually would need the disaggregated information about what type of users or what the purpose of the trips is and everything like that, or what the emissions are, it's all lost. And we need to be able to carry that data the whole way through a process, so that, yes, we need to aggregate to make things run faster or do analysis. And as Esther says, we don't want to be overloaded with data, but we need to somehow then be able to unlock that and unpackage it to be able to understand those users at the end of it. Because that's what we're not designing, roads for bikes as such. We're designing environments for people to be able to do things that are active as part of their lifestyles. And that's the health connection to it. So I think disaggregation to me is the biggest word that we can use on that.
Yeah. And what about network quality? So some great tools there are aimed to capture data on network quality. What are the other sort of areas of kind of best practice you've seen about capturing network quality through these sorts of digital tools?
So I think cycling data in itself as a whole is a gap, for most transport planners. So having any cycling data at all is sort of a positive. And usually what people can get hold of is things like a count, from the cycle counters, or, there may be machine learning cameras at a junction to sort of video capture the movement of people going through a junction. There's actually very little data about the actual network quality. You can get, other methods that people would be using are surveys to literally, use a qualitative survey to ask people their experience, to make reports. Where are they experiencing a near miss, or where is the road uncomfortable? I think they're the commonly available ones, but there can be significant cost with sort of administrating those tools as well. What we're trying to do with C-Sense is to sort of make that data, the sensor data, available from the ride, so it becomes, automatically reported and available on things like the road surface quality, but also swerving and braking, which can kind of indicate patterns of, risk for cyclists, potentially with collisions. It's actually a project we're doing in Birmingham at the moment, is to look at the correlation between where we're seeing this swerving and braking and where collisions are occurring. But it could, also just point to hotspot areas where the safety of the cyclists is more at risk. So something to look at there. But yeah, I mean, I think typically from a cycling perspective, any data at all has been difficult to come by. It has been sort of thought of as a bit of a Cinderella in the data world. There is more data available on other modes generally, but getting insight on the network experience is a new area. I mean, even road surface roughness, the current standard is measuring it from the perspective of a car driver, not from the perspective of a cyclist. And it can be a very different experience.
Yeah.
I think
what are the best ways to do it systematically? Oh, Esther, come in.
I was just going to say, cycling, yes, there's not so much data. Walking, there's even less, I think. And it's the relationship between modes that don't make any money or make very little money and those that do. So the industry seems to be more paired towards those that do, whether it's public transport or driving and selling cars and selling petrol and road, etc. I don't know what the answer is there, but certainly walking, we've had so little in analysis tools that actually work. We've got in London the PERS, the pedestrian comfort stuff. We've got PERS, but we've also got pedestrian comfort levels, which look at the amount of space for a pedestrian, but they really don't look at the barriers. So those drawings that I showed you before with the crosses, they actually came from, or they related to, a bit of real work in a suburban neighborhood of walking the routes and saying, well, if I had a broken leg, or if I was pushing a buggy, or if I was a bit scared, it's like this route doesn't exist for me. And we actually do that sometimes with as a workshop, and we ask people to draw those routes. They give them a piece of string which is 800 meters long and say, well, where can you actually get to from here, or from your house, or wherever it is? And that string just shrinks down for certain people. And then we know that a lot of people never go out, or hardly ever go out. We know something like 25% of Londoners don't travel any particular day before lockdown. So, understand maybe that's right. I don't know, right thing to be. But we really don't understand walking, which is short journeys, doesn't make any direct money, hasn't got the lobby groups. So how do you get an industry to actually invest in understanding walking better? I don't know the answer to that.
Was it, you showed some space syntax in one of those slides? Was that sort of an analysis you were doing?
Well, space syntax is different. So I was showing things at different scales. So I find space syntax very useful when you look at it specifically around land use. So I'm a planner by background. Unfortunately, planning can be very reactive and negative. But if you start to actually think about clustering destinations on the most accessible places of your network, specifically for walking, so the most accessible places if you're looking at shorter journeys, and then you look at walking loops that take in connected destinations, great. But what we see is schools or hospitals or other things being built, planned, edge of. And the number of schools I've seen where they're actually not that far from the town centre, but you have to walk around God knows what to get to them, because no one's really thought about that walking route. But we're right now, I've just finished this morning event on managing streets during lockdown with Will Norman, TfL Cycling Commissioner, and etc. etc. Things are changing massively, and objectives are changing. And we are possibly moving to a world where we're trying to say, actually, our policy objective is less travel. And how do we manage that? And then the travel we're doing shorter journeys. How do we make the journey shorter? That's about neighbourhood planning, and that's about land uses and supporting home working where it's possible. Then the journeys that you've got left, which are shorter, then you look at active travel for them. And the ones you can't do active travel, then you look at more sustainable sharing and what sort of consolidation and cleaner engines, etc. So if you look at a hierarchy of transport objectives, that changes what information we need. And it does mean that understanding those shorter journeys and how to make journeys shorter is key. And I think, you know, what you were saying, Simon, and you showed a picture of how you can model street closures, low traffic neighborhoods, point closures, that is real of the moment at the moment. So the consultation that's happening is generally it's after closures, because their emergency traffic orders are being used to do them. Lots of communities are saying, people in communities are worried. It's been on the news yesterday, you know, on the BBC about this, with people in Hackney going, oh, I'll never be able to live my life again. But actually showing what that means and why it's being done, and that you have still got access. It's just, we're making it so it's relatively easier to walk and cycle than to drive. Yeah. We're not stopping you driving, but the relativity is changing. That model looks like it would be very, very useful to explain that.
Yeah, we also have, I guess, some other challenges for road space. So we've got a question from Alex Reed, and he asks, what improvements in mapping and data need to be made to accommodate the introduction of micro-mobility vehicles, scooters and skateboards? Obviously, you know, these new modes also represent something of somewhat controversial. Do they impact positively or negatively towards active? But equally, what sort of data do we need to accommodate where they should go, and how we're going to improve their efficacy?
Well, I mean, I think safety is a big issue for scooters, and you know, one of the issues that they, you know, been a number of reports about this, and I think the jury's still a little bit out as to how that will go, and that's why we're having the trials, obviously. But you know, the thinking is that they're not to be riding on pavements; that they need to be in the bike lanes mostly. And in that sense, the bikes and scooters are then having to share this space, which that in itself could present some challenges. But one of the things that they do find from a safety point of view for scooters is that they've got smaller wheels, and so they're very much more susceptible to the road surface condition. So whereas a bike can travel over a bumpier road with a bit more ease, a scooter will not find that as easy. So I think that there's going to need to be more data about where the crashes are happening, or collisions are happening, being able to unpack that and study and understand why that's the case. Because in all sort of, you know, it's hard to understand how we can promote a mode that is going to have more safety issues than we currently have, than if people were walking, and if it's actually something that is taking, I think there's been a lot of research that says that people using scooters would have walked, you know, ordinarily. So if we're going to kind of push people onto that mode, I think it does need, the safety issues do need to be sort of thought out, and data can help inform that. Maybe the safety issues aren't as bad as people think. So then again, the data can help to show that and demonstrate. So looking at collisions, looking at the road surface, and being able to understand some of the contributing factors around issues, I think would be really useful.
Yeah, so I think it kind of raises the question around monitoring and verification, because I think one of the other questions with new micro-mobility is the extent to which it does take from other types of modes, whether it's walking, cycling or public transport. Should we talk about monitoring and verification? Because obviously I think that the trials with micro-mobility are a key case in point, where how do we capture as much data as possible about all of the effects that those types of trials are having? Did anyone comment on that? Simon?
I think the key thing there, sometimes we're not going to have anything beforehand. So we're going to need to monitor beforehand, but then we almost need to do what we're seeing now, where people are putting in new schemes and actually monitoring by doing. Because I don't think at the moment we have the luxury of taking our time. And as long as we've tested it for safety and other elements. But then we need to understand what users are experiencing what things, because different users will experience the road or the environment or the speed in different ways. And so a simple part of that could be that what's their view on the speed of the traffic near them, or the environment of that side as well, not just the experience they're having on the facility. What's their experience for understanding the I mean, and Rob, I'm sure you could come in on this, but understanding like what it actually means to say you must park here or you must leave your scooter out or bike in this sort of space. So I think it's monitoring of people's experience, but also how they use the equipment and how they are experiencing the environment beside them. And one last thing, which is how are they actually spending money in that area, which comes back to that walking element. If people are walking, they're going to be spending a lot more money in the social environment. Are they also doing that from an e-scooter or an e-bike?
Thanks. Lawrence, I'd like to add. I'll use wayfinding, I suppose, then as an example again, and I suppose a lot of we get approached by a lot of towns and cities trying to copy the Legible London and the Legible cycle superhighway and the cycle hire. Not every town or not every city is London, and I think some towns and cities need to figure that out. What they're trying to achieve. What they've got in London is, you won't always replicate that, and obviously I think a lot of it is down to finance, but you can use it. So I think it was you mentioned before, actually, Esther, about the monitoring of Legible London. I think it was Steer that did an element of the it was an element of crowdsourced data analysis on Legible London, but it wasn't until back in 2010, I think, when they went from the pilot scheme, or it was the enlarged pilot scheme. I think there were about 60 to 80 signs at that point, whether to roll out across the rest of the city, but not much data has been collected since. But then that could be used, as you say, that you could use that for additional funding. And so yeah, I don't know, Esther, I don't know if you can add to that or not, whether any additional verification has been done on Legible London or not, or any further monitoring by Transport for London.
Not that I'm aware of on Legible London. I think things change.
Yeah.
People have more phones they're using themselves. So I come back to the point I made earlier, is what do you want the data for? So is it to promote a particular product, or is it to overcome a particular problem? And how is it going to be used? Is it to influence others to behave differently, or to have different views, or to vote for a different politician? You know, all of these things matter to what data you want. So it's like, do we need to really know certain things? Do we need to know how certain things are working or not? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. So yeah, I think it's a difficult one. I think Legible London has been incredibly successful, and it certainly helped to change people's attitudes to the public realm and realise that they could walk places. It helped people develop mental mapping at a time when we didn't have smartphones in the way we do now. Whether we don't use A to Zs now, we use sat navs, and it may be that static Legible London stuff will be so superseded. I don't know. But there's other questions that go along with signage. So there's been quite a lot of talk, pressure on DFT at the moment about changing the signage approaches so that they're more about signs for pedestrians and cyclists. Because if you think, all of our signs have been designed for motorists and to be seen by motorists, and their heights as that, and etc. So actually kind of some data and some research into how do pedestrians and cyclists and even public transport users are reacting to signs would be useful to inform change the signage rules. So it's thinking, what are we questioning? Why are we questioning it? And that's something that's coming up with these temporary changes in streets at the moment, because the temporary signs are going in for the drivers in streets which are not then for drivers, which is just doesn't make any sense. Whether we need research to be able to make a change on that, probably we do. Maybe we do. So it all comes back to what are we worried about? What do we want to find out about, and why?
So a lot there about
on Legible London, I'm afraid.
a lot there about the kind of the costs of ongoing monitoring, and obviously that's one of the reasons why it doesn't often get done to the degree that I think it possibly should be. But another question on costs from R. Garrett, who asks, we tend to receive capital monies, but these solutions are normally revenue service contracts, so the solutions we showed in the slides, but also I guess, you know, whether it's monitoring and verification, that's often a revenue expenditure, or whether it's behaviour change to actually make sure the scheme, you know, delivers what it set out to deliver. Does the panel have any ideas on how we can influence government to alter the revenue capital split, so to get more revenue, as it seems to be a reoccurring theme and a barrier?
I think it is. I don't know about the revenue split, but I do know there is an opportunity at the moment. I keep going on about what's going on right now, but we are moving from emergency to temporary to permanent changes in streets. So there is an opportunity to bid for or promote sensible monitoring and data collection to inform that journey. And that is something I think politicians are behind. So I think there are opportunities right now for new potentially funded monitoring systems which relate to the current situation. I was under the impression that there was some funds, you know, some of the funds that go into a big street change include the monitoring requirements, but I'm not an expert on it. Others will know better than me.
Does anyone comment on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think you're right, Esther. There is funding available at the moment. There's announcement by Grant Shapps for emergency travel fund, the emergency travel fund, I think it's called. It's $2 billion for that, and there's different tranches of funding, and cities will be looking from the first tranche, which has just been announced, where some cities have already got that funding to put in cycle lanes, will want to monitor how they are performing. So the stuff that they have put in, are people using? Are they using it? Is there a flow of cyclists on those routes that they built? What's the experience been for cyclists that are on those routes in terms of safety? And getting feedback from people and asking them about their experience on the routes as well. So I think that data will be very relevant to helping to then apply for second tranche of funding, which is then looking to embed these temporary schemes that have gone in place to try to embed the behaviour change and make it permanent, and to build out the network. So there's this emergency funding, but then other councils I talk to say, once they know what they want to do for monitoring and evaluation of a scheme, they can kind of build this in generally into their bids, so that it is part of the proposal that they put forward at the time, rather than trying to add this on as an extra down the track. That they have this upfront view that the monitoring and evaluation using data will be something that they'll want to do. Even creating a baseline is obviously really powerful as well, so that you've got data about what was happening before you made an intervention. And you can come back and do a pre and post, which is really powerful. We're in the fortunate position, we've got quite a lot of data in London actually, just from our customers. So any interventions which are being made in the London area, we do have that baseline to be able to compare to and look at those changes. But similarly in Manchester, we worked on a project there where they didn't have pre-data, but what we were able to see was where they had made an intervention, which was on the Oxford Road corridor. We could actually see where this particular cycle lane finished, and we could see performance of the infrastructure in terms of the flow of cyclists, the speed, were there any braking or swerving or collisions on that piece of infrastructure. And then we can actually see almost where that piece finished, how that changed afterwards in terms of all those factors being really different. So it was all of a sudden people weren't necessarily staying in their lane. There's a lot more mixing, interaction with pedestrians and cars and other things. So there was even some data that you could look at across the city to do a kind of post analysis in comparison with other routes. But I think, yeah, absolutely, that if you can plan your funding requirements up front and build that into your bid, that would be the ideal way to go about it.
So I guess a great question from Gwyn Smith of Sustrans. So says that COVID-19 funding in Wales includes 5% for promotion and monitoring of each scheme. However, each local authority could be doing it differently. Can the panel recommend any methods that could be suggested to achieve consistency across Wales? But I think that applies equally to England. I guess the things that local authorities have in their gift often is some cycle counters. So we may have good numbers. We may have an understanding of numbers in particular areas of the region, but cyclists are obviously very porous and can move around those things. So we don't necessarily have those in the strategic locations they need to be. Survey based, if it was a car scheme, then obviously there'd be some kind of survey based OD matrix that could be developed. Should we be stopping and trying to understand who's cycling where, or should we be using products like yours, Irene, to make sure we've got the OD data? And then how should we be capturing demographics? Are there any other sorts of demographic data that we should be capturing to achieve consistency?
I keep coming in as a non-transport person, but there, especially with town centres, there is non-transport data and output that needs to be collected, whether that's health or it's about biodiversity or it's air quality or it is just appreciation of the place, it's community cohesion, less crime. All these things are often objectives in any transport scheme. We used to use something, I mentioned it before, called PERS, which I never really got behind because it said it said what's the value of the rental market, so the commercial rent and the residential properties in an area, and does that go up after changes have been made to the street? And that was used a lot as a standard process, and it's there's some spreadsheets available somewhere on the TfL website which people can use. But is that what you actually want to measure? Because it's private gain from public investment, generally speaking, so it was seen as a proxy for improvements to the place, as it were, or the economics of the place. But there's other things that we should be doing, and a lot of work on the health side has been looking at health determinants as a data set to justify or to inform the way we change transport and streets.
I think there's an important point there, because I think one of the things which can unite the way we approach monitoring and verification is things like a theory of change or a logic map, where you do map, those individual changes to the outcomes. And I think if everyone makes sure that we're using that in an open and transparent way, then at least there'll be some kind of consistency.
There's also the element that users will change route. So you put in a cycle facility and those that want from parallel routes might come to it. And so you might not have had much gain there, but using something like emissions in that space, even though it was an alternative a scheme that was targeting to increase or improve cycle facilities or walking facilities, using emissions as the measure, or as one of the measures, at least it's slightly independent of that. So it doesn't matter about the rerouting and things. You have that, and it's something that you can then have as a constant as well throughout the period, because you don't want to have to keep going back and, like, you can probably count the number of cars going through there or the speed they're going and things like that, but you probably can't get that too much with cycling except for bespoke points, and walking would be even more difficult. So I think I totally agree that those non-transport measures are going to be really important for monitoring.
So to change the subject slightly, how should we best capture demographic data and the types of demographics that are cycling? So Irene, you showed some great splits where you're identifying women versus male cyclists. How should we be capturing that data and designing things for different levels of abilities?
Yeah, I mean, that was something we introduced. We introduced based on a lot of feedback from transport planners we'd spoken to, because it's very difficult to find data on this, and there's a lot of, I guess, appreciation that if we're going to create a network that's truly going to create a modal shift, we have to make it attractive to a wide range of people. You know, at the moment, you know, there's people, you know, you feel like you have to be very fit and brave to cycle in some parts of the city, just so you can get around very fast. And what we saw when we started looking at our data in that example in Dublin was that women were actually riding on rougher areas of road over the same piece of road. And when we sort of scratched our heads at first and thought, why would that be? And then I remembered back to my experience when I first started cycling, that I thought, you know, I'm really scared of these cars going past me. If I cycle over here in the gutter in the left, I'll keep away from that and I'll be safer. But it was actually with some training I realized, no, you actually have to be confident sometimes, take up the center of the lane to hold back cars behind you if it's not safe, and take up that lane position. And actually, you know, this awareness that, you know, being able to design a road that is attractive to women to cycle on is going to help make it more attractive for more women. So our data is really showing that women do prefer the segregated cycle infrastructure if it's there. And that helps to build your business case and the evidence to do more of that. But yeah, I think profile data is really, really interesting generally. The other thing that we find is being able to understand the needs of the commuter cyclists in general, because there are some other data sets out there which would be kind of very skewed to sort of the sports end of the spectrum, the Lycra, you know, mammal, for want of a better term. So being able to really ensure that you've got lots of commuters in the mix, to really understand those journeys to and from work was something as well that a lot of planners were really keen to unpack. But actually now, with COVID-19, it's very interesting. We're seeing in our data that obviously a lot of those commuter journeys are dropping off, but there's many more journeys actually happening out in the people's residential areas. More shorter journeys going to shops, but also longer journeys than for people taking exercise and things like that. So it's going to be very interesting to see as we, you know, return to work, whether that new normal means that some of those patterns that we thought we had understood actually start to change. So data is going to be very, very useful for those as well. And if you think about it, where we've placed some of the counters on busy junctions in the center of the city aren't picking up some of these journeys now that happen out in the residential areas, where we haven't invested in counters and things like that. So yeah, really interesting to look at and understand changes in the profile or demographic and their experience as well with COVID-19.
I think it's really interesting. And so the discussion, I guess, also points to, and thinking back to Esther's presentation, the way that we experience that isochrone is actually different depending on the different type of person, depending on your particular physical abilities, or a whole range of factors. And it also kind of links back to one of the slides that you showed, Simon, where you showed some variable isochrones for education trips. Is that something we should be laying on in the planning process? You know, thinking about these different levels of abilities.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, Simon.
Yeah, so I think that, yeah, we need to be considering the different levels of abilities. And it comes back to one of the questions which you've got here as well, around people kind of breaking the rules around, or some cyclists are seen as breaking the rules around things. And that comes back to an element of, are desire lines actually being met? Are the signals timed in for pedestrians and for cyclists to actually give them the right amount of priority? And that will help people use them more. Have we reduced the speed to the right level for the environment which people are looking for in that space? Have we reduced the traffic to the right level? And then have we addressed those barriers that Esther talked about? And then start looking at building in a network, then start looking at segregation, or network segregation. And that's the process that we need to be going through to be able to get that that diversity in use. And I think too often we just jump straight to, oh, we need to put in a segregated facility here. But if you haven't reduced the speed and improved the environment and provided the priority, you're not going to get people encouraged to use it.
Okay, I guess the final thing that's worth talking about is the changes that COVID's going to create, because I think there's going to be lots of uncertainty with regards to demand. And I think that affects both cycling schemes and many other schemes that are kind of going to previously got funding or are kind of in the business case stages. What sort of data should we be capturing to really think about that uncertainty?
Well, don't quite understand the question, sorry.
So obviously there'll be lots of, so if 40% of people can work from home, that may be a long-term shift, you know, so certain types of employers may be more likely to have working from home an ongoing solution to accommodation needs. Irene talks about, actually we've got a very big shift going on in the way that people are cycling. Fewer people are doing that commuting trip, but maybe in her data, more people are doing localized trips around their own neighborhood. So it appears to me there's going to be a big change in the way that the demand matrices that we have are actually kind of, they could go in a number of different ways. So should we be factoring in all of that uncertainty, and how would we do that?
Yeah, I mean, everything's changing, and we need to ask people what, you know, survey, we haven't talked about surveys, but a lot of the conversation just before is about actually talking to people and finding out what they think and why they do what they do, whether that's sample surveys or it's local surveys. So sample surveys will give an idea of different types of people, or their behaviors and their decision making. Local survey will show up the local problems that can be overcome, or local aspirations. You know, just opening a new gate to a park could make a fantastic difference to how an area works. So I think there's one thing is understanding people's aspirations for post-COVID normality, whatever that might be, but it's also thinking about what we want it to be, or what politicians want it to be, or city leaders, urban leaders want it to be, and understanding how to get to that point. So it's nudging, it's not just reacting, but nudging. And certainly it looks like it will be the era of the neighborhood. So that understanding of the local journeys, the short journeys, is very different. It feels like the industry in terms of modeling isn't, and potentially data collection, isn't at the moment necessarily set up for the localized neighborhood intricacies of understanding and interventions that we're probably going to be looking for.
Oh, can I come in on that, please? Yeah, I totally agree. And that's where that tool which we show, which is web-based, where you can just close a road and test it, that could be shared with the community if the model is allowed to be more open to, rather than held by the local authorities. The Christchurch example we showed is an open model. We can just pick that up, and anyone, if we made our software available in Christchurch, anyone could just close any road and test what would happen. And that's the power, giving that power back to the community of not just saying, oh, what road would you like to close? Or, oh, how could we create a more local community for you? You could actually let them test that for themselves and give people that power to do that. And I think particularly in COVID, when, like I said at the start, we might not everyone, people might be out of work, or be looking for things to do, and they can help their communities by doing that. We just need to make it, the data and the models, more targeted and also more open.
Yeah, I like the idea of being able to close a road and get feedback on that, because I think that's going to be creating these kind of low traffic neighborhoods is actually going to be key to this neighborhood revitalization that we're going to see, and getting feedback. I mean, that's one of the things that we allow people to report on through the app, is to say, where would you like to see maybe a road closure? So we've got some people reporting on that. But I kind of like with your tool, you can model and say, well, if we did close that, what's that going to look like? And so there's a couple of layers of kind of, ability for people to make that request, but also then model and see what that looks like in practice. Because at the moment, a lot of the temporary cycle lanes that are coming in are being built on major arterial routes. And what you know, and this is probably quite rightly so, it's about moving a volume of people, and it's being done very quickly. But actually in the longer term, understanding, you know, what are all those feeder routes that get onto those? Where are the quiet, low traffic neighborhoods that we might want to create? I think that those elements are going to become more and more important as we move forward. So yeah, being able to model that and show the impact, and allowing people in the community to have a voice about what they want in their own neighborhood, and for them to make use of themselves is going to be really important as well.
For example, there's a lot of talk about school streets and play streets at the moment. The school street came out of the play street. In London, I'm sure in other parts of the country, there's moved for every school to have a school street. A school street could be just improvements around the school gate for social distancing. It could be a timed closure, just when the schools open and shut. Or it could be redeploying some of the space outside the school, making the street one way, but not closing it entirely, or closing it permanently. Now, all of those options are about making the school work better and making it safe to go to school. Play streets are similar. Play streets are more temporary, but there's a real movement for them at the moment. For both the school streets and the play streets lobby, as it were, and initiatives coming forward to use the type of modelling, Simon, that you've shown to say, well, what would actually happen if we went for a one-way or a narrowing or a closure, time closure or a full closure outside this school? What would that do? Or there's 5 schools in this area. What would happen if we did all of them? That's the sort of thing that would build on the catalyst of where the demand is right now. So it's, yeah, and in terms of cycling, so much of what I've seen is not about the arterial cycling routes. We need segregation where there's fast traffic and lots of traffic, but a lot of it now is about the quiet ways and the local short journeys on streets which just don't have very much traffic, or if they do, they're very short. What happens with parking on those streets is really important to the image of whether the street is for the car or for active travel. So it's kind of a psychological issue going on there as well.
Okay, one last question from the attendees, and then I'll ask all of the panelists to do a brief summary. But Alex Reed asks, outside of cities, there are many people in more rural and semi-rural areas that also need to be considered in terms of the development of active travel infrastructure. What do the panel see as the bigger challenges in designing appropriate active travel strategies for these areas?
Well, I would maybe give a plug for e-bikes here, because more and more we're seeing people using e-bikes for longer journeys. We actually worked on a project in Antwerp, where they were very interested to understand people using e-bikes to actually build highways between cities that people could travel on much longer. I mean, the average journey for an e-bike, a non-e-bike user, is about 6 miles or so. On an e-bike, 20 to 25 miles is actually reasonable kind of distance, I think. So being able to understand that, and also the connection into mobility hubs becomes really important as well. So making sure that the mobility hubs that are designed for connections into other modes of transport is really key as well. But yeah, absolutely, rural areas is a challenge, but I think that with the popularity of e-bikes rising, this can be a good solution to help with active travel.
I think, as well as everything, I agree with everything you've said there, and it's about some badly connected suburban areas, metroland areas, as well as semi-rural and rural, is where people are distant from the things they want to get to, as well as thinking about the mode of travel, is thinking about consolidating deliveries, other ways of providing services, local service hubs, bringing back stuff into the communities. So we've had decades of saying people can use a car to get some, as an individual, you go to get something, but actually these communities worked relatively well before the car. And obviously it's a different world now, but we can also turn it on its head and say how do communities work where people aren't individually all having to travel somewhere else to get the things they need, which is also very popular sometimes with people, that they want local services, local community action. That gives heart and soul to where they're living as well.
Part of that will come back to as well, having that data from that community being available to service providers, to freight operators, and people who are like being able to show there isn't a bakery within vicinity of this area, for example. It means that if someone's looking to put in a bakery, that might be quite a nice way for them to work out whether or not they want to be there, or on certain days and things. And so that's where we can come back to the evidence and the data and say, we can map that, we can evidence it, we just need that. It's not an open skill. And so we need to work out how do we support those communities to have things more locally, and how do we then also build a wider network, whether it's with e-bikes or other things, of to plan a strategic cycle or walking links using greenways, canal paths, everything like that integrated into it as well. And so that's all about mapping those networks and bringing that evidence back together.
So Simon, could you use your techniques to show where shared resources or shared deliveries would be viable and where they wouldn't be?
Yeah, I don't see why that wouldn't be possible, because it would you'd basically need to look at your population densities, the demand for those services, how regularly they need to occur. So whether it's grocery shopping, say once a week or something, but vegetables might be twice a week. Well, I don't know. So it's looking at those elements. So you could easily go back to the city data or rural data, I should say, and back calculate that and work out where those gaps are, where the best proximity would be, either for a service provider or for a mobility hub. That's all easily doable with the software, as long as the data is shared.
Because it feels like that consolidation and sharing of journeys and consolidation of deliveries has been a missing link. It hasn't developed as fast as other elements of the transport world, but it needs to, if we're going to achieve what we're talking about.
Absolutely. One last question before I ask the panel to sum up. But Katie asks, and I think this is all in the data, the seasonality of cycling and walking. So the amount of people walking and cycling seems to drop off a lot when the winter comes. Is there anything we can do to encourage people to continue to walk and cycle once the bad weather starts?
Well, Robert is.
Robert?
I'm happy to add. Yeah, so the use of that physical infrastructure really will aid this. It will. You can use that to promote localized businesses or certain streets, certain areas. If you want to drive the public or the traffic to certain areas, they're still seeing the physical infrastructure still seen as the safety aspect. It's a beacon. It's almost like a safe spot. Generally, they're in a well-lit area. So I still really plug for that physical infrastructure. You can. I know before. I think one of the questions was raised about money and the return through walking, especially or walking and cycling. You can get a return on it via potentially localized advertising or certain level of sponsorship. We haven't done that in London, but it has been done in other cities and other areas. So you can get a return on your investment. But yeah, really pushing that the walking and the cycling. It's the highlight of those green spaces. I know we were talking to Walk England about maybe even having an illuminated area on the map to really show that and to really draw people in to those certain areas that we really want to try and publicise.
It's very interesting to have a piece of lighting infrastructure that can also pay for itself through advertising. That's great. Anyone else?
The potholes. So I guess it comes back to Irene's of data. If the road is smooth, is the right smoothness. Like my running buggy at the moment is not liking the weather at the moment. Every time it rains and stops, I can't see everyone. So we need to make sure that we've got the right surfaces down, and those surfaces are appropriate for those weathers, and that's going to help people to be able to walk and cycle or run as we get into winter. The other thing is bus shelters, which I'm sure Rob could cover in a lot of detail if anyone wants any more information on that. But making sure that it's actually facing the right way, it's protected, and you're protected from the environment, because a part of healthy travel is actually walking to public transport as well.
Yeah, I'd like to. Sorry.
So I was going to say, something we're exploring with one of our clients is actually using our data for sort of behavioural nudging, so that so we do see a drop off in winter, and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, in Amsterdam and Copenhagen, they don't get that kind of drop off. So part of it's a cultural thing, part of it is the infrastructure not being good enough to support that. But one of the ideas is being able to look at the weather patterns, against the data that we can see around usage of networks, and start to understand what is the impact, when are those dips happening, and then think about techniques to sort of try to address that. So with this client we're working at the moment is looking at, could we send a message to somebody and say, actually tomorrow, get your kit ready, because sometimes it's better to pack your kit the night before than try to sort of get it out. It's a nudge to say it's a sunny day, or it's actually there's only a 50% chance of rain or whatever. Get on your bike and ride to work. Because one of the things, and I was talking with somebody in Manchester about this, it does rain in the UK, but not as much as you might think. And people have this idea in their head that it rains a lot. And actually, there's many days of the year where it's, you're not in a torrential downpour, and it's perfectly fine to rain, to cycle, even if it's light rain. So it's about encouraging people to do that, and there's different incentives and things that you could build in as well. But I think having the data to understand those patterns, even to say, when are people dropping off, and try to understand what the causes might be. Is it weather? Is it infrastructure? Whatever. All these can be informed by data. And then that allows you to design different interventions based on that. And in closing, I do really like the saying that they have in the Netherlands, I think it is, which translates as, you're not made of sugar. If you get a bit of water on you, you're not going to melt. You will be okay.
I don't know about you, but I am.
But yeah, essentially you do have to manage the infrastructure and make it attractive to people as possible.
Okay, great. So final thoughts on the panel. So Rob, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to join into Irene and what Simon alluded to. It's a comfort thing. No one really wants to cycle or walk in the cold or the wet, but that's why we're trying to, at Trueform, we're manufacturing the physical infrastructure that's comfortable, that you would want to, if you're to try and really move people from taking that personal mode of transport to going on to public transport. It's got to offer the same, or at least close to the same level of comfort. So whether it be, as Simon said, waiting within a bus shelter, it's got to be a nice, warm, safe, well-lit environment with all those necessities that we would look for as a paying publican. But yeah, so what I was, and I think what Esther said about, Irene said about Grant Shapps, it was, I think there's been 70% rise in people on bikes for exercise or for socially distanced travel. And he's trying to get, obviously, many more millions to do this. We've got some way to go to where Ireland's got to. I think I read last week, 20% of the transport budget is going on walking and cycling, which is equivalent of 360 million euros per year for the next 5 years. Really, it's that investment that's necessary. That's the level of investment that's required. And these temporary measures, they really need to be turned into a semi-permanent or a permanent solution. This is the time really to drive home the walking and cycling revolution.
Right, Irene, final thoughts from you?
Final thoughts is, I guess, you know, the topic of this session is around mapping and evidence. I was delighted when I saw this session because it really speaks very much to what we care about, because I think that having data to put forward your proposals is so powerful. To have the evidence to show the impact of those proposals allows politicians even to maintain that drive and willingness to continue doing what they're doing. If you've got the data to back up and show that you have made an impact, you've got different metrics, and as Esther talked about, there's wider metrics as well about, you know, how you can look at the impact on the environment, the air quality, congestion, quality of life for people in cities and towns. But having data to back up how you've created that allows you to keep doing more of it. So I think that, you know, I'm in the corner for cycling, definitely, but the cycling has been an area where there hasn't been enough data in the past. So, you know, we hope to help contribute towards those discussions very much, but also seeing cycling as part of a wider intermodal mix that hopefully is part of a, you know, overall helps to sort of decarbonise the transport that we have in the UK.
Great.
So,
Simon?
Great choice of topic, and thank you very much for inviting me on.
Thank you. Simon?
I guess the key thing is disaggregation of data, making sure and sharing of it. So making sure that we carry that data the whole way through, we share it, we share the models, and we track that back to the aim, which is health. So we have to remember when we're putting these in, it's all, or putting anything in or testing anything or evaluating anything, it's all about, is this actually delivering health benefits to the community? And how can we get the community to actually buy in and help design that as part of what we're doing? Because I fear that too often we forget that yeah, we're delivering health benefits, we're delivering decarbonisation, we're not necessarily delivering asphalt. That's all.
Right. And Esther, final thoughts?
I suppose what we've been talking about, data and modelling, is about how people respond to places and use places. And we do need to understand that, both to be able to speak truth to those who are making decisions and policies, so that those policies and objectives are actually realistic. There's that side of it which we haven't discussed at all. So we do see policies and proposals coming forward from whoever, and they think that's just not going to work. And data and mapping should help us to understand what will work and what won't work. And then once changes are made, to see whether or not we are meeting the objectives that were set for those changes. So I think the link to understand what we need to know and why we need to know it and how we're going to use that data is absolutely key. And that continually changes because our priorities change. So that's my non-technical approach to it.
Great, thank you very much. So remains for me to say thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to Esther, to Rob, to Irene and to Simon. And thank you all for attending. Do keep a lookout. We're going to be doing a couple more webinars, one of which I'm very excited about. So do keep a lookout for that. Thank you for attending.